Random number generation, or RNG, is the system that lets computers pick random numbers, or at least as random as computers can get. This is useful for many things. Obvious ones like determining if you get a +5 bastard sword of burning from your boss encounter, but it can also influence much more subtle things, like how blowing wind affects cloth, or if an AI decides to rush you or take cover behind a rock. RNG systems range from incredibly complex and convoluted to so simple you can keep track of it in your head of what the next RNG value should be. But how does this actually affect you playing games? The most obvious example I can point to is speedrunning. If you're familiar with speedrunning at all, you're going to be more than familiar with RNG. Or if you watch Keizerun play how much RNG can ruin your plans for a speedrun.
There we go. Ooh.
Being able to predict what will happen next in a game is a huge advantage, but not every game can do this in a way where it will actually benefit you. There's two major schema when it comes to how games work with RNG. They're either deterministic, meaning that given a set of inputs, the outcomes will always be the same no matter what, or they are chaotic, meaning that even when given the exact same inputs, the game will behave drastically different every time. Think something along the lines of Mario versus Call of Duty. In Mario, RNG calls are used to determine things like if a character should blink, or when coins are spawned, how far up and how far out they fly, and things like that. In Call of Duty, they'll determine things like where your bullets land on the screen, or if a character spawns with an assault rifle or an SMG, which can affect the meta of how you approach the level. This is a massive simplification, and giving details on deterministic gameplay is well out of scope for this video, but for the purposes of RNG, these systems are where you need to look at. Deterministic games are where RNG starts to become very, very interesting. Games will select a starting seed or a number value to kick off the random generation. This can be something like the current Unix time, aka a specific number of milliseconds since 1970, hashing the user's profile name, hashing controller inputs, combining several of these together, or simply just hard-coding a value, or starting at 0. Once a seed is selected, the game's RNG algorithm will run whenever a random number is requested, an event called an RNG call. Along with the call, there is also a second piece of code that keeps track of how many RNG calls there are, and will cause the RNG algorithm to increment the seed, so it now has a new number to base its random calculations off of. The specifics of this vary from game to game, and it's incredibly rare for two games to sample RNG in exactly the same way. To explain how this works on a deeper level, let's take a look at the source code for a port of a classic game and reverse how they do their RNG calculations. Doom is a PC shooter game released in 1993, designed to run on Class 386 processors, and it featured the world's first widespread implementation of binary space partitioning. In other words, it was one of the first games to use software rendering to cheaply draw a 3D environment, which helped it run on the slower processors at the time. Given the horsepower of what we're looking at here, there's really not a whole lot of free CPU cycles to throw at crunching random numbers, especially in a game where you can make upwards of 100 RNG calls every frame. To optimize this and help free up system resources, programmer John Carmack cheated a tiny little bit on the RNG, and he actually pre-calculated the RNG table that the game uses. He then put the output values into an array, and whenever prandom is called in the game increments this counter and moves down to the next value in the array. There's also mrandom present as well. Prandom is used for local network events, so damage, gun firing, monster spawns, that kind of thing. Mrandom is used for visual effects like locally, so screen wipes, that kind of stuff. They both use the same source array but different offsets on that array, so they can both have different RNG values at the same time, using the same source. Very efficient. Doom makes many RNG calls constantly. When an AI tests the environment to see if it can walk forward, try walk is called, which as a subset calls prandom and performs a bitwise AND on the result to determine how far forward it should walk, or if it even can, or if it needs to check for a door, or any number of things. When you fire the super shotgun, a staggering 100 calls to RNG are performed, 5 per pellet fired to determine accuracy, damage, visual effects, so on, with 20 pellets fired in total. Given how small the pool for available numbers are, it's literally just 256 values, it's fairly easy to identify the pattern in the RNG. Maybe difficult to manipulate one specific value, but if you wanted to make it so enemies in a specific area are more likely to be less accurate than normal, you can set that up in advance with some accuracy. It's also what makes Doom's demo playback system work the way that it does. We have demo files recorded from the late 90s that you can play back and watch in full quality on your computer in 2020. This is accomplished because of Doom's deterministic nature. It's not a video file, it's an input file. Demo files are nothing more than a recorded series of inputs. Since prandom and mrandom both start in the same spot, and RNG calls are advanced purely by in-game play, one set of inputs on the exact same frames of gameplay will result in the exact same output 100% of the time. Games like the Halo franchise use this for their theater mode, and you can actually see direct descendants of this exact code present in games today, such as Modern Warfare 2019, which you can trace its roots back to the Quake 3 engine, which also traces its roots back to this demo system. I'm also pretty certain that they use that system internally to look up problematic matches after the fact, given that every match has unique IDs in the corner, but that's speculation for another video. RNG manipulation is becoming more and more common, especially in communities like the speedrunning community, where you need every possible variable controlled to ensure you can finish your runs with the lowest time possible. It's probably most famous in the Pokemon speedruns, where the RNG manipulations for Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire are so utterly insane that if you are trying to make a world record attempt run, you have about a 3% chance of actually finishing your run. There are multiple manipulations that can only occur on specific frames of the render, as RNG is called at least once, if not multiple times per frame, meaning you have to time something to 1/60th of a second, have very specific step counts, prior setups, etc., and if you miss these specific manipulations, instead of catching a Pokemon that is as strong as possible and helping you cheese the run, you can catch a mediocre or even a rather weak Pokemon, meaning fights take longer, you're more likely to lose those fights, and all in all, can result in a run that is tens of minutes slower than the record. The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker is another example of an RNG fest that can utterly destroy runs, with its Sploosh Kaboom minigame that happens about halfway through the game. However, recently the community discovered a way to test the engine to figure out the RNG state and the current RNG values, and they built a tool to figure out what the next board will be in the minigame, to remove even more randomness from a run that was 10 hours long to one that's now under an hour. Side note, I'm not trying to claim that Wind Waker was purely random, that's why it went from 10 hours to sub 1 hour. If you'd like more information on Wind Waker speedruns, there'll be 2 videos in the description, one for Sploosh Kaboom and one for Barrier Skip, both fantastic videos. RNG is a fascinating topic. There is really no way to get truly random with computers. The closest we've come is random.org, which will seed its RNG values with the background cosmic radiation found in space. There's others that simulate this approach, like Cloudflare. They run hashing algorithms on a camera feed that's pointed at an array of lava lamps. Since no 2 frames of video will ever be 100% identical, when you factor in things like lighting conditions, the specific placements of the lamps and like the colors and intensities and everything of them, on top of that things like ISO grain on the camera, compression artifacts, outfits people are wearing that day, time of day, there's so many variables that basically make it random. But for video games, a lot of this is completely overkill, or just way too processor intensive, and you can't really dedicate that much power to a relatively simple system. It's also why most games will start with, for example, a seed of 0, or they'll start with the current time of date, because it's good enough for games. And most games will use RNG in a very similar fashion to what we've discussed so far. They'll call RNG to determine if you should get an encounter on this tile of grass or not. They'll call RNG to determine if you have a creeper spawn, or if you have a normal zombie spawn. They'll call RNG to see what idle animation an NPC should start playing, or what event script should fire, or if it should rain, or if you'll get poisoned. Any event in a game that is random is just doing a bunch of fancy math behind the scenes to make it happen. And now that you know that, you can do a bunch of fancy math to make random never random again.